The true story of Gaddafi. From the crescendo of cheers, a man whose name was on every lips, the echoes of regrets, the start of a revolution. A legacy meets its demise. What happened to the once loved and respected, turned mad dog of the Middle East? Let's bring it back to where it all started. Muammar Abdulmia al-Gaddafi was born in the year 1942 to a peasant family in the desert region of Sirte, Libya. Though the son of a poor Bedouin nomad, he went on to attend the traditional religious primary school and then a Sebha secondary school. During his school days, Gaddafi and a small group of friends he met in school formed the core leadership of a militant revolutionary group that would eventually seize control of the country in the 1960s. Gaddafi's inspiration came from Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of neighboring Egypt at the time, strengthening his ideologies and making him a committed Arab nationalist. To understand the whole picture, we could say Nasser was that guy. He was well known for his Arab nationalist and anti-colonial foreign policy. His pan-Arabist ideology, Nasserism, which was named after him, had won a great following in the Arab world in the 1950s and 1960s, in which Gaddafi wasn't any different from others that were swept off their feet. Gaddafi later went on to study at the University of Libya, and in 1961, he entered the military college in the city of Benghazi. He then spent the last 4 months receiving military training in the United Kingdom, where he found many of the cadets were reclining towards his anti-Western nationalism, and he took that opportunity to form a secretive group, dedicated to overthrowing the pro-Western Libyan monarchy. Gaddafi did not embrace the idea of the West having such a huge and strong holding in Libya, a country rich in oil, and so he was determined to live up to his ideologies. In 1965, upon coming back to Libya, he was assigned as a commissioned officer in the Libyan army. With this, his plan to overthrow the then ruler of Libya, King Idris, was in motion. King Idris I was a political and religious embodiment of a leader who had been ruling Libya since December in the year 1951. On September the 1st of 1969, while King Idris was in Turkey seeking medical treatment, a group of Libyan army officers under the leadership of Gaddafi launched a coup, formerly known as the Al-Fateh Revolution, from Benghazi, and he quickly established control over the country. This coup was bloodless, and Gaddafi was wasting no second to finalize the plans of taking total control of the country. He immediately named himself Commander-in-Chief of Libya's armed forces, government, and chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council. All this at the age of 27. This guy was on steroids. Gaddafi soon began implementing his long-awaited dreams for Libya. Gaddafi's first order of business was to shut down the American and British military bases in Libya. Next, he had demanded that the foreign oil companies in Libya share a bigger portion of their revenues with the country. Following that, Gaddafi had planned to establish a more religiously driven society. For that, he replaced the Gregorian calendar with the Islamic one. And in line with his own strict Islamic principles, he forbade the sale of alcohol and gambling. In December 1969, some of his fellow military officers, namely Lieutenant Colonel Adam Al-Hawaz, the defense minister, and Lieutenant Colonel Musa Ahmed, the interior minister, had attempted a coup to take over his yet still brewing regime, but failed. After their imprisonment, Gaddafi became bothered about a political uproar occurring again, so he decided to establish a law criminalizing political dissent. But that wasn't all. In 1970, he expelled the remaining Italians from Libya and emphasized what he saw as a battle between Arab nationalism and Western imperialism. He actively was against Zionism and Israel, and he expelled the Jewish community from Libya. He seized the assets of both Italian residents and the Jews, making them have no choice but to leave the country. As Gaddafi's power grew, his inner circle of trusted people became smaller and smaller, and his power was shared by himself and a small group of associates. He sent intelligence agents to travel around the world to intimidate and assassinate Libyans living in exile that were believed to be part of the global scheme. In attempts to realize his anti-Western ideologies, he sought to direct Libya away from the West and towards the Middle East and Africa. Gaddafi began a series of persistent but unsuccessful attempts at unifying Libya with other Arab countries.
فخامة القائد معمر القذافي وللشعب الأمي.
To do that, he involved the Libyan military in several foreign conflicts, including in Egypt and Sudan, and the bloody civil war in Chad. He was adamantly opposed to negotiations with Israel and became a leading figure in the Arab world in the rejection of the Egyptian-Israeli peace process. And in 1973, he nationalized all foreign-owned petroleum assets in the country. Look at this picture. At first glance, it looks like a random book, but it's not. This is the book famously known as the Green Book, the beginning of Gaddafi's Islamic socialism rule. He published the Green Book in 1975, Al-Kitab al-Abha, having 110 pages with 28 chapters. This book became Libya's unofficial constitution, ranging from chapters on the instrument of government, the law of society, the party to the sport, horsemanship, and the stage. The book was divided into 3 chapters. The first part of the book spoke on the solution to the problem of democracy. Gaddafi rejected democracy as we know it. He believed that political decisions in which one candidate is granted victory simply because they obtained the highest percentage of the vote by the electorate is dictatorial. Gaddafi argued that such systems, despite their democratic veneer, were inherently dictatorial. He believed that the outcomes were manipulated or falsified, undermining the principles of genuine democracy. Gaddafi's perspective was rooted in his own political ideology, known as the Third International Theory, which emphasized a form of direct democracy through people's committees rather than traditional representative democracy. He stated that the parliaments have become a legal barrier between people and their right to exercise authority. His solution was that of direct democracy. This involves establishing popular conference and people's committees, where all members of the society participate in shaping the policy of the state. The second part of the book spoke on the solution to the economic problem. For thus, he had said, the claim that the income from the public-owned establishment benefits all society, including the workers, is true only if we take into consideration the general welfare of the society and not the private well-being of the workers. According to the excerpt, it does seem that Gaddafi's plan was to take on communism while simultaneously refining socialism. He went on to state that the solution to this is to abolish the wage system, which in his view would, unquote, be emancipating people. Things like land was no man's own, and land is a private property of none. Rather, everyone has a right to beneficially utilize it by working, farming, or pasteurizing. Living in another man's house, whether paying rent or not, compromises freedom. Gaddafi had also spoken on the transportation and ownership of vehicles, saying that transportation is also a necessity both to the individual and to the family. It should not be owned by others. The third and last part of the book he named Social Basis of the Third Universal Theory. This guy was a clever way of naming things. In this chapter, he brings together all he had been saying explaining the Third Universal Theory. He said, as I quote, the Third Universal Theory heralds emancipation from the fetters of injustice, despotism, exploitation, and economic and political hegemony for the purpose of establishing a society of all the people where all are free and share equally in authority, wealth, and arms. Freedom would then triumph definitively and universally. To him, a new socialist society is a happy society that derives its happiness from being free. Such a society is only governed by free amenities, easy living, and one in which individual satisfaction of needs are realized without exploitation or enslavement of others. After establishing all this, Gaddafi had begun to implement it into Libyan society. He combined the nationalization of many economic sectors with a brand of populist government operating through people's congresses, labor unions, and other mass organizations. Several reforms never seen before were up and running. For example, Gaddafi had the females of the state in the military also serving as his personal guards. Alongside the innovations that were being introduced in 1977, the system of government guided by the Green Book called Jamahiriya. Oh, and by the way, this is not a real word. Gaddafi made it up, but Jama'a refers to the masses or the people. I, a suffix denoting possession or belongings. Riya, a suffix indicating a state or condition. Together, we have Jamahiriya, a perfect system of government based on Gaddafi's beliefs. The Green Book followed the Libyan people wherever they went, at school, on television, and in the streets. But how did Gaddafi's trouble with the West begin? How did the once thriving nation of Libya become a city of rubble?
Several weeks ago in New Orleans, I warned Colonel Gaddafi we would hold his regime accountable for any new terrorist attacks launched against American citizens.
America had believed that Libya launched an attack on them first, and they decided to fight back. In 1986, April the 14th, the United States of America launched airstrikes on Libya. The United States operation was a retaliation to years of Libyan-sponsored terrorism against American interests, and this operation was known as Operation El Dorado Canyon, marking a dramatic turning point in the tense relation between the two nations. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, Libya became a sponsor of various anti-imperialist and Muslim groups worldwide, and in response, the US imposed sanctions, which had sparked a cycle of escalating hostilities. In 1981, the clashes in the Gulf of Sidra and evidence of Libyan-sponsored terrorist plots strained relations further. There was also the bombing of a US embassy-sponsored DAS in Khartoum, leading to the death of 5 Americans in 1985. Then came April 5th, when terrorists bombed the West Berlin dance hall frequented by US servicemen. Investigations were made and the intercepted messages were found to be from Libya, thus adding weight to the accusation that Libya was behind the attack. The United States, under President Ronald Reagan, decided it was time to respond forcefully. And so the airstrikes on April 14th commenced, targeting Tripoli and Benghazi. 14 A-6E Navy attack jets and 18 F-111 bombers were involved in the operation, flying over 2,600 nautical miles to circumvent French airspace. Operation El Dorado Canyon was deemed a success, but not without cost. Gaddafi's adopted daughter was killed, and residential buildings were hit. International reactions varied, with the French embassy in Tripoli also facing unintended consequences. As the attacks subdued, the tension between the US and Libya had started to lay low, but not for very long. In 1988, Pan AM 747 Airlines in Lockerbie, Scotland was bombed. All 259 passengers and crew of the flight were killed, and 11 people on the ground perished. Investigators on the case identified Libyan intelligence agents Abdel Basset, Ali al-Megrahi, and Lamin Khalifa Fiumar as suspects in the bombing. The UN had intervened and requested Gaddafi to provide those responsible, but he refused. In 1992, the United Nations then imposed sanctions on Libya for refusing to hand over the 2 men suspected of bombing the Pan AM flight. In 1999, several years later, after the UN had passed a resolution to impose sanctions on the country, in an effort to ease the sanctions, Gaddafi agreed to turn the suspects over to Scotland for trial in the Netherlands using Scottish law and prosecutors. In early 2001, al-Megrahi, one of the suspected intelligence agents, was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. In accordance with the United Nations and American demand, Libya accepted responsibility for the bombing. The United Nations, as well as the US, had now lifted its sanctions against Libya, and the resolution remained that the country had to pay each family's victim approximately $8 million in compensation. Following that, countries like the US still did not believe that Libya was remorseful for the event that had occurred, and they were proven right in 2004. In 2004, Libya's Prime Minister had stated that the payment made was only the price for peace, meaning that they just did it, so it was just to appease the countries at hand, nothing more, nothing less. The aftermath of the bombing had left Pan AM Airlines bankrupt, and in respect of the attack, Libya was here to compensate them. With the bombing, the attacks, and the sanctions, everyone's eyes were on Gaddafi, waiting for the next order of events. And in February of 2011, the Libyans fought back, not against the other countries, but against themselves, against Gaddafi. On the 15th of February 2011, anti-government rallies were held in Benghazi by protesters who were angered by the arrest of a human rights lawyer called Fethi Tabel. The protesters called for Gaddafi to step down and to release all political prisoners. An arrest worth noting was that of 2 University of Tripoli students accused of being part of a secret anti-revolutionary organization. In April 1984, a gallows was constructed next to a 10 by 20 foot portrait of Gaddafi. At the entrance of the university, the 20s were brought out before thousands of other students, and they were publicly hanged. This was very important, as it served as one of the things that really showed the people how authoritative and dictatorial Gaddafi was. Moving on to the happenings in February 2011. At first, Gaddafi sent the Libyan security forces to use water cannons and rubber bullets against the crowds as a way of disbanding the rally, but it didn't quite dissuade the people from their aim. The military officers then opened fire on the protesters, arresting thousands of them and others suspected of supporting the opposition, holding many in secret detention and carrying out summary executions. The initially peaceful protest movement transformed into a fully fledged armed uprising against Gaddafi's 42-year rule. The protests intensified, the demonstrators taking control of Benghazi, and unrest spread into Tripoli. The Libyan government began to strengthen their lethal force against the termed rebels as this sparked the civil war. Gaddafi was ready to deny taking responsibility for the present chaos in the country and spoke against false media reports of mass killings. Several videos were released in the actual war ongoing in Libya, and yet he chose not to address it. Soon enough, the international pressure for Gaddafi to step down increased as the violence continued, and several foreign nationals had to be evacuated, leaving only the people of Libya to fight for themselves. The UN Security Council unanimously approved a measure that included exacting sanctions against Gaddafi's regime, which included imposing a travel ban and freezing the Gaddafi family's assets. Soon after, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, military interference with 8 months of intense conflict made Gaddafi and his inner circle find themselves cornered and isolated in the coastal city of Sirte, Gaddafi's hometown. On October 20, 2011, early in the morning, Mutassim Gaddafi, the son of Muammar Gaddafi, who had helped lead the defense of Sirte, ordered his father, his inner circle, and some remaining loyalists to abandon the District 2 of Sirte in a convoy of some heavily armed vehicles. The escape attempt proved void as a NATO drone-fired missile was launched at the heavily armed vehicle, destroying one. Gaddafi and the other survivors from the convoy fled to a nearby walled villa compound, and then tried to escape through the fields and through drainage pipes underneath a major road nearby. That is where they were then caught by the Misrata militias. Muammar Gaddafi was immediately beaten, his buttocks wounded with the constant hits from the bayonets. They messed him up. They also began throwing blows at him and kicking. He was dragged all over the place as they wished to all get a piece of him. By the time Gaddafi was loaded into an ambulance and transported to Misrata, his body already appeared lifeless. As they reached the hospital, Gaddafi was pronounced dead. Following his death, people who had immersed themselves in Pan-Africanism movement, as well as those who saw Gaddafi strive for a better country and a better Africa, had condemned the Western media for painting him in the bad light. They were against the people of Libya and they believed that they had killed Gaddafi while he was trying to do good for them. Libyans begged to differ. They celebrate his death and their newfound freedom from his 42-year rule. Present reports did show the decline of the Libyan economy rapidly after Gaddafi's demise, but the people chose not to relate this to the effect of the civil war. I see this as people not just wanting a dictator whether or not he was good. To them, there was no good done by one who infringed on their rights. From a small boy with humble beginnings to a highly respected leader in all of Africa, Gaddafi had reached a place to make his ideologies real, but he was killed in such an undignified way. Was Gaddafi really one whose aim was only for the betterment of society and nothing more? Or was he just a heartless dictator who thought that he could play his cards right? Let us know what you think in the comment section.